They thought it was just a quiet village until one pitchfork changed everything. Sounds like made-up war folklore, right, because who captures armed men with farm tools? But it happened. On a cold morning in occupied countryside, a German patrol cut across a field they'd crossed so many times it felt routine. No mines, no ambush line, no gunfire, just a quiet farm and a path that looked harmless. That's why they didn't fan out. That's why rifles stayed low. That's why they walked like men who believed the land belonged to them. What they didn't know was that the farm kid living there 19 years old, skinny, untrained, the one Germans dismissed as irrelevant, had built something no officer would have approved and no manual would have recommended. Not a weapon, a behavior trap, a trap designed for one simple fact. Soldiers get predictable when they feel safe, and in the next moments, the field turned into a panic machine. Boots snagging, legs dropping, rifles clattering into dirt until trained men with guns realized they couldn't move without paying for every step. 19 of them would raise their hands, not because they were outgunned, because the ground under them stopped being ground. The first mistake the Germans made wasn't stepping into the trap. It was believing the farm was empty in the way occupied land always felt. Empty, quiet, obedient, harmless. A place where people kept their heads down, worked their soil, and prayed the patrols passed without noticing them. That belief is what turned a routine march into a surrender. The region had been occupied long enough for fear to settle into habit. The patrols didn't arrive like thunder anymore. They arrived like weather unwelcome, unavoidable, and strangely normal. They checked barns, they asked the same questions. They took what they wanted and left footprints that everyone pretended not to see. For the boy, it wasn't politics, it wasn't ideology, it was arithmetic. Each patrol meant less grain, less milk, less certainty. And the more the Germans moved freely across his family's land, the more the farm stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a corridor, something the enemy used, not something you lived in. He was 19, but not in the way city boys were 19. No softness, no extra time. His hands had grown old early. Rope burns, splinters, calluses that never fully healed. The war didn't teach him hardship. It simply weaponized what he already knew. He wasn't trained. He didn't have a uniform, no rifle drills, no shouted commands. The only manual he'd ever followed was what his father had taught him in scraps of advice that sounded simple until you realized they were survival rules. If you can't stop something head on, you make it step wrong. That's how farms worked. Animals didn't respond to strength, they responded to placement. A fence didn't fight a bull. It convinced the bull to go the other way. A gate didn't overpower livestock. It funneled them. Even pests, rats, foxes, weasels, you didn't defeat them by chasing them. You defeated them by learning what they always did when they thought no one was watching. The Germans, he realized, behaved the same way. Not because they were stupid, because they were human. The patrols cut across the same field because it was shorter. They stepped over the same shallow ditch because it was easier. They stayed loose because nothing had ever punished them for being loose. Occupation doesn't just control land. It trains the occupier to get lazy. And laziness creates patterns. That was the boy's advantage. Not bravery, not firepower, pattern recognition. He noticed it in the smallest ways first. Boot prints appearing in the same strip of soil. A cigarette butt tossed near the same fence post. The way their laughter always got louder once they reached the open field because open ground felt safe. Then he noticed something that made his stomach go cold. They weren't just passing through anymore. They were getting comfortable. One morning he watched them from behind a broken gate as they walked toward the barn like they owned it. One of them kicked at a bucket. Another leaned his rifle against a wall as if he was visiting a friend. They spoke casually, pointing at livestock, touching equipment with the careless hands of men who believed consequences didn't apply to them here. The boy didn't move, he didn't shout. He didn't reach for a gun because he wasn't thinking like a fighter yet. He was thinking like a farmer watching pests test a fence line. If you scare them off once, they come back smarter. If you hurt them in the wrong way, they bring fire. He had heard enough stories. Whole homes burned after a single soldier went missing. A neighbor dragged away because someone refused to hand over food. A cousin beaten in the road because a patrol decided it could. A dead German meant a raid. A wounded German meant anger. But fear, real fear, could change behavior without triggering immediate revenge. That was the line he kept returning to. He didn't want a massacre. He wanted the patrols to stop walking through his life like it was nothing, and the idea didn't arrive like genius. It arrived like exhaustion. It was late in the season, the kind of morning where the air bites your lungs, and the ground still remembers rain. He was out by the ditch, repairing a section of fence, when he planted the pitchfork into the soil, and it sank deep, almost too easy. The earth there was softer than it should have been. He paused, pushed again, and felt the tines disappear into mud like it was swallowing them. The ditch wasn't just a ditch. The waterlogged patch around it had a weakness, a place where the ground could betray weight. He looked up at the open strip of field the patrol always used. He pictured Boots stepping over that ditch without even glancing down. He pictured the rhythm of the march, the habit of speed, the comfort of repetition, and he thought something so simple it almost embarrassed him. What if the safest-looking step was the worst one? That's where a military mind would jump to mines. Explosives, a clean kill, but a farmer's mind jumped somewhere else. Traps, not traps meant to kill. Traps meant to stop, to twist, to snag, to create chaos without creating corpses. He didn't announce it to anyone. He didn't ask permission. He didn't tell the resistance because telling people meant people would argue, and arguing meant delay, and delay meant the patrol would cross again tomorrow. So he worked the way poor families always worked, quietly, stubbornly, and at night. When the village slept, he carried tools into the field like a thief. Not because he was stealing, because he was building something he couldn't explain without sounding insane. He dug narrow pits where a boot would land if it followed the usual path. Not deep enough for a man to vanish, but deep enough to drop an ankle, twist a knee, and ruin a sprint. He lined the edges with sharpened wood, not to stab a body, but to make movement painful and hesitant. He pulled wire from broken fences, the kind left behind from shelling and neglect, and stretched it low where tired boots would catch. Then came the pitchforks. He didn't set them like weapons. He set them like hooks buried at angles hidden beneath straw and dirt, positioned so that when a man stumbled, the pitchfork wouldn't kill him. It would grab him, catch clothing, pull packs, turn a stumble into a fall, turn a fall into panic. The point wasn't blood. The point was the moment a trained soldier realizes he can't trust the ground. Because when you can't trust the ground, you can't rush, you can't flank, you can't retreat cleanly, and you definitely can't keep laughing. By the third night his hands were raw, his back etched from digging. He kept stopping to listen because every sound carried farther in the cold. Once he froze for a full minute when distant engines passed on the road, convinced headlights would sweep the field and catch him crouched in dirt like an animal. But no one came. That was the other lesson the war taught him. The occupiers rarely looked closely at what they already believed they understood. A farm is a farm, a ditch is a ditch, a teenager is a teenager. That belief was the camouflage. By the time the trap was finished, the field looked the same as it always had. Uneven soil, straw, patches of mud. The kind of ordinary mess no soldier ever studied. And that was the brilliance of it, if you could call it brilliance. It didn't look like defense. It looked like nothing. The boy checked it at dawn, standing at the edge of the barn, staring at the path where bootprints always appeared. His heart beat hard, not with confidence, but with a feeling he hated, hope, because hope was dangerous. Hope made you reckless. Hope made you forget what the Germans could do if they decided you were a problem. He told himself one thing over and over. I only need one moment. One moment where they stop walking through here like they own it. One moment where 19 armed men realize the powerless kid on the farm isn't powerless at all. And as the morning light lifted over the field, he heard it. Boots' voices, the casual sound of men approaching a place they thought was safe. The patrol was coming. The patrol entered the field the way men always do when they believe nothing can hurt them. Loose spacing, easy voices, rifles hanging low, more burden than threat. They weren't scanning the ground. They were scanning habit, checking the barn, the fence, the treeing, looking for resistance. The way soldiers are trained to look for resistance. Guns, faces, movement, not soil. The boy watched from the barn loft, breath shallow, fingers numb around the stock of an old hunting rifle he barely trusted. He hadn't come up here to shoot. He came because height gave him one thing the field didn't: perspective. The lead German stepped over the shallow ditch without slowing. Then his foot vanished. It wasn't dramatic at first. No explosion, no flash, just a sudden, violent sideways pull that twisted his leg and dumped him hard into the dirt. His scream ripped through the quiet field, sharp and confused, the sound of pain arriving before understanding. Everything stopped. The second soldier froze instinctively, lifting his rifle. The third stumbled forward to help and caught a wire he never saw. His boots snagged low, his balance snapped, and he crashed down into another hidden pit, swearing loudly as pain shot up his leg. Shouts overlapped. What happened? If wait will mine is availed. Watch your step. One of the cess too late. The ground had already begun doing its work. A fourth man tried to rush forward and slipped when his foot hit a pitchfork tine buried at an angle. The metal didn't stab him. It hooked his pack, yanked him backward, and dragged him off his feet like a hand pulling him down. Rifles clattered into the dirt. The patrol spacing collapsed as men crowded together, trying to help without knowing where it was safe to step. That made it worse. The traps weren't in one place. They were spread just far enough apart to punish panic. One man tried to step backward and dropped with a curse. Another froze mid-stride, leg trembling, terrified to commit his weight. Orders were shouted in German, contradicting each other, overlapping, dissolving into noise. The boy's heart slammed against his ribs. This was the moment he'd feared most, because chaos could go in either direction. If one of them spotted him in the loft, if someone fired blindly and hit the barn, if fear turned into rage, he forced himself to wait. Fear always spikes before it settles. He needed it to settle on his side. From the German's perspective, nothing made sense. There was no crater, no wire leading anywhere obvious, no sign of explosives, just men falling, screaming, bleeding, trapped by a field that looked identical to every other field they'd crossed in the last year. That was when one of them shouted the word the boy had been waiting for. Stop, a day. It cut through the panic like a slap. Movement slowed. Men froze mid-step. Those already down stopped struggling, afraid that fighting the ground would only make it worse. A wounded soldier tried to pull himself free and yelped as a sharpened stake scraped his leg. The realization spread fast. The ground itself was the threat. From the loft the boy finally spoke. His voice cracked on the first word, but it carried sharp, loud, and unfamiliar. Drop your weapons. Oh, for half a second no one reacted. They had training, numbers, guns, but training didn't tell you how to charge when you couldn't trust the space between your own feet. One officer straightened, trying to project authority through the confusion. He shouted back, threatening, demanding the boy show himself. His men didn't move to support him. They were too busy watching the dirt. The boy swallowed and raised the rifle, not at a man, but at the ground near a trapped soldier's head. He fired once. The shot cracked across the field, the bullet tearing into soil inches from the man's face. Dirt sprayed. The message landed instantly. I can shoot. I just don't want to. That was the pivot. Fear stopped being abstract. Hands went up slowly. One rifle dropped, then another. A helmet hit the dirt with a hollow thud. The officer shouted again, but this time his voice wavered. His men weren't listening anymore. They were bleeding. Some were stuck. Others were terrified that moving would only trigger another fall. One by one, 19 armed soldiers did something that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. They surrendered. The boy didn't move. He kept his rifle trained loosely on the group, heart racing so hard he felt dizzy. This wasn't triumph. It was control. Fragile, terrifying control that could shatter if he made a single mistake. Don't move, he shouted again. Stay where you are. Okay, they obeyed. Minutes stretched. The boy waited for engines, for reinforcements, for the sound of trucks or boots on the road. Every second that passed without it felt unreal. Eventually, voices rose from the edge of the field, villagers, then resistance fighters drawn by the gunshot, by the shouting, by the impossible rumor already spreading through the nearby houses. When they saw the scene, they stopped dead. 19 German soldiers disarmed, pinned by mud, wire, and farm tools. No firefight, no bloodbath, no dead bodies, just fear arranged carefully in the soil. The fighters moved in cautiously, cutting wire, helping the wounded free, securing weapons. Laughter broke out, not mocking, but stunned, disbelieving laughter. The kind you make when reality breaks its own rules. Someone asked the boy how he did it. He didn't answer. His hands were shaking too badly. Hours passed before the prisoners were marched away. Only then did the boy climb down from the loft, legs weak, stomach tight. The field looked ordinary again, disturbed earth, scattered straw. Nothing that explained what had just happened. But something fundamental had shifted. Word traveled faster than the patrol ever could. By nightfall, people in nearby villages were whispering the same sentence over and over, changing slightly with each retelling. The Germans were stopped by a farm kid, Islando. They're afraid of fields now. If and fear once it changes sides doesn't change back easily. The next day, a patrol approached the area and stopped at the road. They didn't cross the field. They didn't spread out. They turned around. A week later, another patrol detoured entirely. Soon, fields weren't shortcuts anymore. They were questions. And for the first time since occupation began, the boy walked his land without feeling like it belonged to someone else. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt exposed because he knew something no one else did yet. This only worked once. If the Germans adapted, if they came back in force with fire and anger, there would be consequences far beyond him. The land had fought back. Now the war would respond. The surrender didn't echo the way gunfire did. There was no explosion rolling across hills, no smoke column pointing to a battlefield. What spread instead was hesitation, quiet, invisible, and far more dangerous. By the second morning, German patrols were still moving. They had orders, schedules, routes that existed on maps drawn months earlier. But something had changed between the ink and the boots. They slowed. At road intersections, men stopped to argue longer than necessary. Officers dismounted to study terrain that had never required study before. Fields that once felt like shortcuts now felt like traps waiting to be remembered because the story didn't spread as facts. It spread as fear. 19 men captured where no shots fired. Ivan Escode, a farm boy, 2000 weld the Vum's pitchforks round of low vine. Every retelling stripped away logic and added something worse, uncertainty. No one knew exactly how it had happened. That was the problem. Mines could be detected. Ambushes could be suppressed. But how do you counter something that looked like nothing? The Germans responded the way armies always do when doctrine fails. They hesitated first, then they overcorrected. Patrols doubled up. Boots stayed closer to roads. Open ground was avoided whenever possible. Movement slowed to a crawl in places where speed had once been routine. That had consequences. Supplies arrived late. Messages lagged. Units missed rendezvous windows. Small delays stacked on top of each other until operations that relied on timing began to fracture. The boy didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was simpler and more immediate. He was now visible. The day after the surrender, he found fresh bootprints at the edge of the road, stopped there, turned around. No crossing, no barn search, just a pause, then retreat. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a warning because avoidance meant attention. Ad inc meant questions, and questions meant someone somewhere would eventually decide to answer them with force. The resistance fighters came that evening. Quiet knocks, low voices. They wanted to know who he was, what he'd done, whether he could do it again. He didn't brag. He didn't exaggerate. He explained it the way he understood it. Plain, careful, almost apologetic. He showed them the pits, the wires, the angles of the pitchforks buried beneath straw. Some nodded, some frowned. One man shook his head and said, "The thing everyone was thinking, this will get you killed, is one." The boy didn't argue. He already knew that night. He lay awake listening to every sound, replaying the moment over and over. He wasn't afraid of what he'd done. He was afraid of what came next because traps change behavior only once. After that, the enemy adapts or escalates, and escalation in occupied territory never stays contained. By the third day, German command began asking questions. Why had a patrol failed to report on time? Why had 19 rifles vanished from the field? Why were local routes suddenly unreliable? The first explanation was incompetence. The second was sabotage. The third was resistance activity, but none of those fit cleanly. There had been no firefight, no destroyed equipment, no obvious signs of a prepared ambush, just soldiers who had walked into something and come out without their confidence. That didn't sit well with officers trained to believe control came from force. So they ordered reconnaissance, not loud, not aggressive, quiet. Men were told to observe fields, to watch farms, to note anything unusual, ditches, disturbed soil, changes in routine. The boy noticed them almost immediately, not because they were good, because they were careful. He saw it in the way eyes lingered longer than before, in the way boots tested ground instead of striding over it, in the way rifles stayed ready even when nothing appeared wrong. Fear hadn't made the Germans reckless. It had made them cautious. That was worse. He stopped working the field during the day. He avoided the barn loft. He left tools where they belonged. Everything about the farm had to look exactly the same as it had before. Ordinary was now his camouflage. At night, he went out alone to dismantle what he could, removing obvious wires, softening disturbed earth, making the trap look like it had never existed. Not because he regretted it, because he knew repeating the same trick was suicide. A good trap works once. A second time it becomes a lesson for the enemy, and lessons are dangerous. But even as he erased the physical signs, the psychological damage remained. German patrols no longer crossed fields casually. They stayed to roads and tracks, bunching movement into predictable corridors. That made them safer in open ground. It also made them easier to watch. The resistance noticed it first. Movement patterns changed. Timmets shifted, routes narrowed. Suddenly, entire stretches of countryside became gray zones avoided not because they were controlled, but because they were uncertain. That uncertainty was leverage. Within a week, small acts of resistance became easier. Messages passed undetected. Supplies moved when patrols hesitated. Scouts could predict German movement with surprising accuracy. Not because the Germans had become sloppy, but because they had become cautious in the same ways. Caution creates its own patterns. The boy understood that instinctively. Animals that are frightened don't behave randomly. They overuse what feels safe. They return to known paths. They hesitate at unfamiliar ground. He explained it to the resistance fighters one night, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. Fear doesn't stop movement, he said, it channels it, said Arford. Duh. They listened not because he was eloquent, because what he described matched what they were already seeing. German command, however, drew a different conclusion. They decided the area was compromised. The response wasn't subtle. A larger patrol was ordered through the region not to search, but to demonstrate control. Boots on roads, vehicles visible, noise where silence had crept in. The message was clear. We are not afraid. The boy watched them pass from behind a hedgerow, heart tight. This was the moment he'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time. Because demonstrations of control only work if nothing goes wrong, and now something always could. He didn't build another trap. He didn't touch a pitchfork or dig another pit. He did something more dangerous. He let the Germans move exactly how their fear had trained them to move. The patrol stayed on the road. Tight formation, eyes scanning fields they no longer trusted. They didn't enter the barnyard. They didn't cross the ditch. From the German perspective, this was adaptation. From the boy's perspective, it was confirmation. The trap had already done its real work. It had rewritten instinct, but rewriting instinct invites retaliation, and retaliation was coming. Late that evening, the resistance warned him quietly. German officers were asking about the farm, about the boy, about who lived there. Questions don't stay questions for long. The boy packed nothing. He didn't run, he didn't hide. Running would confirm guilt. Instead, he prepared for something else. Absence. The next morning, the farm looked untouched. Animals fed, tools stored, no sign of panic, no sign of resistance. When a patrol approached the gate, they paused, looked, tested the ground with the cautious footwork of men who had learned a lesson. They couldn't explain. Nothing happened. They moved on. And in that moment, the boy understood the full weight of what he'd done. He hadn't just captured 19 soldiers. He had taught an army to doubt the ground it stood on. That kind of lesson doesn't fade quickly, but it does provoke answers. And somewhere above him, decisions were being made that would bring the war closer to his door than ever before. Because fear might slow an army, but eventually an army always tries to crush the thing that taught it fear. The knock came after midnight, not loud, not urgent. 3 slow taps against wood, the kind of knock meant to test whether someone was asleep or pretending to be. The boy was awake. He had been awake for hours, lying still, listening to the house breathe the way it always had. Wind moving through cracks, animals shifting in their stalls, the quiet weight of night pressing down on everything. Another knock, this one firmer. His heart dropped, not because he was surprised, but because the waiting was over. German boots scraped softly against stone outside. He could hear at least 2 voices now, low and controlled. No shouting, no threats. That was worse. He slid out of bed without turning on a light, pulled on boots he'd placed carefully beside the door hours earlier. Every movement felt loud inside his head. Even though the house stayed silent when he opened the door, lantern lights spilled across the threshold. 2 soldiers stood there, rifles slung but ready. An officer behind them, older, sharper eyes, the kind that measured before speaking. "We are checking farms," the officer said calmly. "Routine. If you 2 minds," the boy nodded once. Routine, the word meant nothing anymore. They stepped inside without waiting for permission. The soldiers moved through the house with practiced efficiency. Not ransacking, not threatening, just observing, noting, looking for things that didn't belong. Disturbed soil tracked indoors, tools left where tools shouldn't be, anything that suggested intention. The officer lingered near the doorway, watching the boy's face rather than the room. "You live here alone?" he asked. "With my family," the boy answered. "They're visiting relatives. Is one described a son?" The officer hummed softly, as if considering whether that mattered. Outside, another pair of boots circled the barn. The boy's mind raced, not with panic, but calculation. He had dismantled the traps. He had erased the obvious signs, but you can never erase everything. Dirt remembers, so does fear. The officer walked slowly toward the table, brushing fingers across its surface, then stopping at a pitchfork, leaning against the wall. He lifted it, testing the weight. "A farmer," he said, "not a question. Yes, wearing this." The officer turned the pitchfork slightly, examining the worn handle, the sharpened tines. "Interesting," he murmured. For a moment, the room felt too small. If they asked the wrong question, if someone decided to dig, if this turned into accusation instead of inspection, the boy kept his expression flat. Farms had always been searched. Tools had always been handled. Normal was still his only defense. Outside, a soldier called something out in German. The officer responded without looking away. Then he smiled just a little. "You know," the officer said, "some of my men are nervous lately." Backed as friend, the boy said nothing. "They say fields are dangerous now." The officer continued that the countryside fights back. "I have dud." He set the pitchfork down carefully. "Nonsense," he said. Land is well." He studied the boy's face one last time. Then he turned and left. The soldiers followed. The lantern light vanished. The door closed. The boy stood there for a long time after the sound of boots faded, waiting for the moment relief might come. It didn't, because he knew what that visit really meant. They weren't searching for proof. They were measuring reaction, and that meant the next move wouldn't be cautious. It would be decisive. By dawn, the resistance had already heard. German command was planning something larger, not another patrol, but a sweep. Multiple units, dogs, engineers. The kind of operation meant to remove uncertainty by force. Fields would be crossed, barns torn apart, soil turned over until nothing felt safe for anyone. The boy faced the choice he'd been avoiding since the first trap worked. Disappear or act again. Disappearing meant survival for him. Acting meant danger for everyone. The resistance argued quietly in a candle-lit room. Some wanted him gone by nightfall. Others believed the psychological advantage was too valuable to lose. He's already done enough. One man whispered, "Let the fear linger. It is that." End quote. Another shook his head. Fear fades. Germans respond to patterns. If nothing happens, they'll convince themselves the danger was imaginary. It's dog. The boy listened without speaking. Then he said something that ended the debate. They won't sweep the fields unless they think they have to try. The room went quiet. They're afraid, he continued. But fear alone won't make them destroy the land. Something has to push them. It not one Billy Stone. Someone asked the question no one wanted to ask. What? That's really the boy didn't answer immediately because he wasn't talking about another trap. He was talking about letting the Germans make a mistake, one they couldn't ignore. That afternoon, the resistance moved him out of the farm, not to hide him, but to watch. From a ridge overlooking the valley, he could see the road the Germans now favored. Vehicles passed there in tight formation, engines loud, movement rigid. Safe ground, predictable ground. The sweep began the next morning. Soldiers spread out along the edges of fields. Engineers prodded soil with rods. Dogs sniffed along hedgerows. It was thorough, methodical, and angry. The farm was torn apart. Barn floors ripped up, ditches widened, fence lines dismantled. They found nothing. No explosives, no weapons, no resistance fighters. But the sweep itself created the thing the boy had been waiting for, frustration. By the second day, German officers were impatient. Men were tired, equipment bogged down in mud, progress slowed, and frustration makes men revert to shortcuts. Late in the afternoon, an officer made the call. They would cross the field again. Not the whole unit, just a section, enough to show dominance, enough to prove the fear was unnecessary. From the ridge, the boy watched them step off the road, his breath caught. Because this time there was no trap waiting, no wires, no pits, no pitchforks, just memory. The soldiers moved slowly at first, prodding ground, spreading out. Nothing happened. Confidence crept back in. One man laughed. Another picked up his pace. The line loosened. That was when the boy understood something new. The trap had already evolved. It wasn't in the soil anymore. It was in their heads. The resistance didn't attack. They didn't reveal themselves. They let the Germans walk the field uneasy, jumpy, constantly checking ground that offered no threat. The sweep ended without incident. But it failed because it didn't remove fear. It proved it. From that day on, German movement changed permanently. Roads became crowded. Fields became avoided spaces. Entire sections of land were written off as not worth the risk. The boy didn't need to act again. The first act had been enough. That night, the resistance moved him out of the area, not as a fugitive, but as someone whose work was finished. The farm returned to being just a farm, but nothing about it was ordinary anymore. Because everyone who walked past that field, German or civilian, knew the same thing. Once the ground had fought back, and even if it never did again, no one would ever step there without remembering it could. The Germans never returned to that field, not because it was mined, not because it was defended, but because it was remembered. Maps were updated quietly, routes redrawn, orders adjusted with language that avoided specifics. Avoid open ground, limit off-road movement, maintain formation. No report ever mentioned a farm boy or a pitchfork, but behavior told the truth. Convoys slowed where they used to rush. Patrols hugged roads even when it cost time. Fields that once felt neutral became psychological obstacles, spaces filled with imagined danger, that hesitation rippled outward, delays stacked, schedules slipped, small inefficiencies compounded into larger failures. Units missed rendezvous windows. Supplies arrived late. Orders lost their sharp edges. All of it traced back to a single realization no one wanted to put on paper. The countryside could no longer be trusted. For the resistance, the change was immediate. Movement became easier not because Germans were weaker, but because they were predictable again, predictable in caution. Messages crossed fields the occupiers avoided. Scouts learned where patrols would not go. which was often more useful than knowing where they would. No new traps were built, none were needed, fear did the work. The boy didn't stay to watch it unfold. Within days of the sweep, he was moved out quietly, not as a hunted man, but as a solved problem. His presence was no longer necessary, and worse, it was becoming dangerous. He left without ceremony, no farewell, no recognition, no sense of victory, just a final look at the field as dawn broke, soiled dark with dew, utterly ordinary again. It was strange how quickly something terrifying could look harmless. Elsewhere, German command tried to rationalize what had happened. Engineers proposed explanations that never quite fit. Officers blamed discipline. Some insisted it had all been exaggerated, rumors amplified by nerves and local superstition. But superstition, once seated, behaves like doctrine. Months later, captured reports would describe certain regions as unreliable terrain. Not hostile, not fortified, unreliable. It was an admission armies hate to make. For the boy, life moved back toward what it had been before work, early mornings routine. His hands returned to repairing fences instead of building fear. The war rolled on elsewhere, louder and bloodier. But his part in it remained quiet. He never spoke publicly about that morning, not because it was secret, because to him it wasn't a story of triumph. It was a moment when power briefly changed shape. He had not defeated an army, he had not fired a battle shot. He had simply taken advantage of something armies forget. People and soldiers move by habit until habit betrays them. Years later, historians would catalog resistance movements in terms of weapons and operations, sabotage counts, casualty numbers, supply disruptions. Stories like his didn't fit cleanly. There was no battlefield, no kill count, no medal-worthy statistic. Just 19 men who surrendered because the ground beneath them stopped feeling safe. And that kind of damage doesn't show up in reports, but it lasts. Wars are often remembered for their machines, tanks, planes, artillery. We measure victory in steel destroyed and territory taken, as if power only exists in fire and force. But occupation doesn't survive on weapons alone. It survives on certainty, certainty that the road is safe, that the field is harmless, that resistance is pointless. The moment that certainty cracks, everything else weakens with it. The farm boy never set out to make history. He didn't study doctrine or plan a campaign. He didn't imagine himself as part of something larger. He just understood his land. He understood where people stepped without thinking, where they trusted without checking, where habit replaced caution. And in one brief moment, he turned that understanding into leverage, not with violence, not with technology, but with patience and placement. After the war, the field returned fully to silence. Crops grew where men once froze in fear. Animals crossed the same ground that had undone soldiers. To anyone who didn't know, it was just another piece of countryside. But memory has weight. Those who had been there never walked it the same way again. Because once the ground fought back, and it proved something armies rarely admit. You don't always defeat power by confronting it. Sometimes you defeat it by making it hesitate. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a bomb or a trap you can see. Sometimes it's the quiet realization that the safest step might be the wrong one.